All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today is our third event in our series for the Climate Education Month. This series is brought to you by our Sustainability Vista at University of Hawaii Hilo, Anya Benavides. And today we're going to be exploring the topic of the intersectionality of queerness, women, and environmental oppression. We have one more event in the series that'll be next Friday on the topic of reimagining invasive species on a changing planet. And with that, I will turn it over to Anya.
Thank you so much, Laurel. Welcome everyone, or welcome back to the 2021 Climate Education Series, where, like Laurel said, we've been offering talk story sessions throughout the month, focusing on intersecting topics surrounding sustainability. And what I mean by that are topics where we explore the root causes of the climate crisis while also honoring and exploring different ways that people are growing, adapting, and healing to the rapidly changing world. Last week, we heard from Leilani Ka'unani Yates as she shared her story of healing through art. This week, we're going to transition into a discussion that explores the intersectionality of queerness, women, and the environment with Lala Nuss and Mariana Monasi. I understand that the words, even in the title alone, carry so much meaning, and this is something that we will acknowledge and explore during the session. This topic holds deep importance to me, and both Lala and Mariana are women that I consider courageous, powerful, and inspiring and look up to. So I am so excited to delve into the discussion. But first, I'm just going to share with you a few guidelines for this session, as well as introduce myself. So Laurel Pecunis will be our chat moderator for this session. So if at any moment during the session, throughout the session, you have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. And during the last 30 minutes of the session at 1, we'll go over all of those questions. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat whenever you feel compelled to do so. And before we go any further, Mariana is going to share her screen, and we're just going to go over some of these terms because language is so important, and we understand that, you know, even with these terms, we could hold very different meanings for them. So we're just going to go over the meanings that we are going to explore for these terms throughout this session, while still understanding that, you know, these are just one way of explaining them, and that there are many. So intersectionality, a lens or prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. Eco-colonialism refers to various ways in which colonial practices and oppression have impacted the natural environments of Indigenous peoples. Queerness, a reappropriated word used as an umbrella term that is both an orientation and a community for those on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum. Pinkwashing, the term of LGBTQ+ related issues in positive ways to distract from negative actions by the same entities and inherently attempting to create a hierarchy of oppression. And next slide. Just a few more. Feminism, the belief in full social, economic, and political equality for women in response to Western traditions that restricted the rights of women. Indigeneity, those who make up an Indigenous population, most often in connection with land and place. These are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. Ecofeminism explores the repression of women and the environment as interlinked and rooted in patriarchal structures. Intersectional environmentalism addresses how the injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. All right, so those terms we'll be coming back to throughout the session. And we'll share this at the end of the session too, but we just wanted to get that out there to start with. And I will just briefly introduce myself to you before turn it over to Mariana and Lala. So some of you already know me, but if you don't, my name is Anya Ellen Benavides. I'm here with you today, like the last sessions, from my home in Mountain View, near the top of the skinny Ahupua'a of Waikahekaheki in the Moku of Puna in Hawaii. So during the last sessions, I shared with you a piece of my ancestry. I shared my relationship to this place and what has inspired me to create these sessions. While this week, I'm going to share a part of myself that I have only begun to acknowledge in the last few years, and that is my queerness. My queerness is something that I rejected for much of my life. And today I want to acknowledge Mariana for inviting me to speak on her podcast, Pariwarmi, this summer. Having the space to share with Mariana, as well as having such a powerful network of women in my life, is ultimately what has inspired this session. So before we move along, I want to offer one more acknowledgement. And this is a movement that I'm going to discuss that may be triggering. So if you need to take a moment or space, please, take that. And I want to be mindful that this movement is triggering. So it is the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples movement. So we can go to the next slide if you can. So the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people dates back to the beginning of colonization and continues with direct ties to the desecration of their lands. Indigenous women and girls are murdered at a 10 times higher rate than all other ethnicities. And quote, the majority of these murders are committed by non-native people on native-owned land. The lack of communication combined with jurisdictional issues between state, local, federal, and tribal law enforcement make it nearly impossible to begin the investigative process. That's from nativewomenswilderness.org. These murders have also been directly linked to the man camps used for extracting oil, gas, and mining. So I want to pose a question to everyone here today. And as Kelsey Vilmus writes, 710 Indigenous people, mostly girls, were reported missing over the last decade in Wyoming, the same state where Gabby Petito disappeared. Gabby Petito's disappearance was widely covered across nearly every national news platform. According to a January report published by the state's Wyoming's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force, 21% of Indigenous people remain missing for 30 days or longer, while only 11% of white people remain missing for that long. This information was also shared by Lakota Law, and I'll share that resource later. And then Hawaii specific, more than 75% of all trafficking victims reported being homeless, and 64% of survivors identified as being part Native Hawaiian. So we're gonna go to the next slide. And then Lala is going to share.
Yeah, aloha mai. Aloha mai kako, everyone. Yeah, just wanting to lift up the juxtapose of what we're going to talk about today a little bit, and really wanting to lift up the importance and positionality traditionally that wahine and mahu had within traditional societies. And this just wasn't within, say, the Pacific or North America, but all Indigenous cultures, even in Europe, looked at wahine and mahu as really important aspects to society. And as you can see here, women and Two-Spirit people have traditionally been community leaders and activists, especially in contemporary times, around the protection of Mother Earth and really the peace building aspect of what makes a society healthy and abundant. And these two quotes here I wanted to bring into the room, and these resources will be shared later as well. But to kind of give a place-based perspective of what's happening here with both our wahine as well as mahu communities when it comes to environmental justice initiatives taking place. In this first quote, by exploring the Oiwi concepts of Lohaina and Pilina at the intersections of Ike, Hawaii, Indigenous queer theory and Indigenous feminism offer an interdisciplinary investigation of ea, or Kanaka Maoli modes of nation building and governance. And this is an excerpt from the new book that just came out by the infamous Jamaica Osorio. This next quote is by my beloved Tita, who couldn't make it here today, but wanted to lift up her work as the first Native Hawaiian transgender or Mahu PhD ever. And her quote in the work that she's doing around her doctorate or finished doing, and the work she continues to do. In what ways are Maka'ainana, people of the land, and Kapoe Honua, people of the earth, disrupting abandonment, unsettling sexualities, and decolonizing identity politics and solidarity through chosen family arrangements and makeshift economies? And this is by Dr. Tatiana Kalaniopua Young, who I've been had the pleasure to stand next to and work and play with, whether it was on the Mauna or in Waianae Valley at Ka'ala Farms, a lot of other Alohaina initiatives that she's a part of, especially the work with Pua Honua Waianae and Auntie Twinkle's them in Waianae, looking at housing and sovereignty in that way. So I'll stop there, but we'll talk story more kind of on these juxtaposes of the incredible vulnerabilities and exploitation and injustices that Wahine and Mahu have experienced globally, but also their positionality, both traditionally going back thousands of years, and their positionality today as we continue to deal with and experience injustice from an environmental perspective. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Lala. And yeah, we can stop sharing now because we're actually going to transition into hearing both Lala and Mariana's origin stories. I just want to acknowledge that I first met Lala over the summer when she was serving as the Climate Resilience and Equity Program Manager. We were on a retreat together at Kahumana Farms. I remember quickly feeling inspired by the discussions that she facilitated. And on that same trip, I met Mariana, but not too long before we had actually met over social media activism. I followed Mariana's photography account and we just started talking about change and liberation. And we finally met on the same trip that I met Lala. And there's really so much that I could share about the impactful work that both Lala and Mariana have done and are doing. But I am excited and ready to turn the space over for them to share. So Mariana, I am going to ask if you want to share your origin story with us.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you for having us. Thank you for putting all of this together, Anya. My name is Mariana Monasi. I was born in Lima, Peru. And I'm the daughter of Tere and Marcelo Monasi. I'm the sister of Marcelo and Felipe. I'm the only daughter. I'm the youngest in my paternal side. I have 7 aunts and uncles on my mother's side, 6 aunts and uncles on my dad's side. So I come from an extensive family. We moved to San Diego when I was 11, but since I was pretty much born, I've always had a deep connection to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean. And that continues today to be the place where I feel most at peace and connected, and where any ailment or stress or anxiety I feel can be washed away. I grew up playing sports. I actually ended up here in Hawaii because I got a scholarship to run cross country and track at UH Manoa. I ended up staying here and went to grad school, got a master's in public admin, focused on nonprofit management. I also served with AmeriCorps in environmental conservation in grad school, which is aside from my education here at UH Manoa and having teachers like Noe Silva and reading from Haunani K. Trask and so many other strong women here that have been at the root of movement work that really like radicalized me and allowed me to see as an Indigenous person who has not had the experience of living on their own land as an adult and learning from my own ancestors, I have learned most of what I hold dear to me and what I believe is extremely important, if not the most important, movement work that is saving our cultures, our Indigenous cultures, saving our planet, and building community. And I'm so grateful. I also want to add that having grown up in a place like Peru, that is, oops, sorry, can you guys still hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, sorry, the screen went away. Having grown up in a place that was colonized so long ago, there's like really a very like a strong separation between most of the people that live there now and like Indigenous practices. Sorry for the beeping in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. Yeah, it's been difficult for me to reconnect with a lot of my own indigeneity, and I've done a lot of research and I want to learn more, and that's been something that I struggle with, because I am a settler on this stolen land, and so I really see it as like part of my own responsibility, and to be not just an ally but an accomplice, to continue to preserve and take back the land and take back the power of the colonizers, because I can see the own effects of like what if there is no stop to it, what it might look like hundreds of years from now. So I love this place so much. It has changed. It has like fundamentally created the person that I am today, and I have so much love for the people and the land here. It's also because of colonization in Peru, most people are Catholic, and that also means highly homophobic a lot of times. And living here and learning about the culture and learning about how people were accepted here, and not just accepted, but like valued members of society as queer people, allowed me to actually like be comfortable with who I was and welcome it and learn more about it. And so I also want to thank everyone and all of the land and all of the people and the culture for welcoming me and allowing me to explore my genuine self. So some of the work I'm doing now is around that. Like Anya mentioned, I have a podcast called Kwariwarmi, which is actually the name for the third gender that was used in the Inca Empire in Peru many hundred of years ago. And I love community building. I know these women also. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing now is like community building. I'm doing some consulting work for nonprofits and communication and marketing. And I'm also a photographer and an artist. And a lot of my own work is rooted and inspired by nature, culture, and community building. That's my origin story.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mariana. That was very powerful. And now we get to hear from Lala, her origin story.
Yeah, mahalo nui. Mariana, mahalo for sharing. That's you know, every time we have these kind of spaces where we have to, you know, give origin story, it's really neat that I get to learn a little bit more about the individuals that I know on a certain level and to go deeper. So mahalo for that and bringing in your ancestry, your kupuna into the room and your siblings. Yeah. So my story, I was born Lorian Baird Hukuli'i Helfrich. That's my birth certificate name. Many know me by Lala Nuss. My family's been in Hawaii for 4 generations. We've intermarried with Hawaiians and Puerto Ricans, and my background, where my roots in genealogy come from, are Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean. Similar, I resonate with Mariana's experience around the degree and timing of colonization that say similar to you, my Taino, as well as West African ancestry experienced, if I'm just looking at Caribbean 500 years before, say, where I'm at now, right? And going back, and I think for me, being Kikyo Ka'aina, being raised in Hawaiian culture, raised by Tongans and in the Pacific, right? I feel really lucky because what it did, it caused me, I think about if I was raised someplace else. What it did was it caused me to be rooted and have a worldview that's focused on your identity based on where you come from, your genealogy, and what that cultural background looks like. So as I got older and I wanted to explore my own genealogy further, being able to go and find connections between what Kanaka Maoli understood, whether it was our spiritual beliefs and the relationship to mythology and akuas that are related to land-based elements, right? Being able to find that back in my Taino backgrounds or even West African, right? But the language is gone as far as going back to Taino and having, say, like archives like Native Hawaiians have been able to carry on to continue on that ike, and just understanding like, Hawaii is a really special place, I think, especially right now in our global times, to really center around what's happening in this hulihia and this movement back to our roots. A little bit about my growing up. So grew up on Oahu, born at Kohuku Hospital, and grew up in Honouliuli, along the shores of Oneula and Old Ewa Beach, when it was still all plantation village. And now it's, turned into the second city and suburban sprawl. So within my lifetime, seeing mass transition of my Aina that I knew that raised me, right? And then graduated from Manoa, actually, grew up riding horses and being in the ocean and dancing. Those were the forms of embodiment that really raised me in many ways and shaped who I am as well. So I want to acknowledge that. But graduated from Manoa in behavioral science and also grew up as a Pan Am baby. So my parents worked for Pan American Airlines, for those that may remember that iconic airline industry. So since I was in my mom's tummy, going back to identity, I was traveling the world. It was a privilege I had. We weren't rich, but working for the airlines, we had this incredible privilege. And my parents raised us to go to a place and really know how, going there to want to learn about the place, right? So being able to come in as visitors and identify and share differences and nuances and samenesses is something that I've always been curious about. So the binary of identities have never really stuck well for me, whether it was through borders of nations or ethnicities. I never understood these kind of black-white boxes and lines that were drawn in the land to separate people and places. And after graduating from Manoa, I left Hawaii for 8 years and joined the travel industry myself. Wasn't planned to, but worked on the cruise line industry. So went actually back to some of my native lands in the Caribbean. So it's all through the West Indies and the Caribbean and Central America, Mexico, all the way up to Canada, moved to the East Coast and joined the Fortune 500 accommodations hotel industry, and worked my way up the corporate ladder in New York and Boston and Miami and Panama, and then came home about 12 years ago. Also worked for private jet companies, so got to understand what that top 1% lives like, which is a whole nother world of intriguement. And came home with a different set of eyes, and came home for Kuleana as the hiapo, or the eldest in my family. My father got ill and heeded the call to come home to make sure he was okay and our family was okay. But saw something happening in Hawaii when I came home that I didn't see when I left. And that was kind of like my generation starting to, and I'm 41, moving into their leadership roles, really centered and rooted in cultural values and Aina-based values. Like this was like Ed Kenny and Mark Noguchi 10, 12 years ago when they were making sustainability sexy, and the farm to table movement, right, was taking off. First Fridays in Chinatown. And mind you, I'd been all over the world, from Miami to New York and the Caribbean. And so being exposed to that level of art and culture and coming home and kind of seeing this bubbling of that here with Aina and arts initiatives really pulled me in. And I spent the first couple of years trying to reroute myself, getting oriented. I'll admit I had to come home and be humbled a little bit. Thought I was kind of this big bad local girl coming home during the last economic crisis and would slide into Waikiki, get my job, save my family, and everything would be good. And that didn't happen. I got to be a part of the movement taking place around the farmers markets and working as vendors there, and odd and end jobs around Aina initiatives or food and beverage, learning how to run restaurants and things like that. And eventually got back into Waikiki and did work around sustainability. You know, I've been doing that pretty much in my travel industry career. Had always had kind of this idea of being on the sustainability committees. How do we get our hotels energy green certified, things like that. But then eventually left because it was so disconnected from what I was leaning into and getting pulled towards as far as alignment with values to people in place here, and started Conscious Concepts and got to work for grassroots nonprofits and arts movements like the Honolulu Biennial, now the Hawaii Contemporary. Used to run Arts at Mark's Garage, working with Miley Meyer and Indigenous artists and commissions, as well as a lot of place-based community development and Aina work, like working with Uncle Eric Enos, looking at water and food and cultural sovereignty and these holistic holographic spaces. And started Conscious Concepts, which is what I'm back now into. Got to the last 2 years before jumping back into social entrepreneurship and consulting work. Actually went and worked for the city and county of Honolulu, and I never thought I would go and work for government ever, but had an opportunity, and I heeded that call and spent 2 years working for the city and county of Honolulu, standing up their climate resilience and equity program. So that was an incredibly challenging and amazingly hard experience. And I learned so much going in there with this idea of what does equity look like within the element of climate change. And then we got COVID that hits, and then we got the economic crisis, right? So I'm sitting in the belly of the beast, making sense of, here I am with this equity hat on, what the hell does this all mean, right? And really started being able to see the weaving and the patterns when we talk about Indigenous worldview, the Ike and knowledge base around that I've been able to cultivate and learn from is the holistic systems approaches, right? And the patterns and connections of this, and seeing that from an equity lens. Was really insightful in the learning and development that I've been able to gain and hopefully be back and give back and being in service to these spaces, these radical spaces that we really, that are being asked of us at this time. So I'm really excited now to shift my piko from Oahu now to Hilo, back here in Waikiuka, in our families, Aina up here in Hilo, and really centering, I think, a little bit more radically and rigorously in rooting to not going back to normal, not building back better, but really leaning into the fugitive spaces of undoing, and not just undoing, but moving into what are we creating that's not there yet, or that's already embodied this simultaneity that's being asked of us, this ancient and this modern, and what does that look like from healing, transformative justice, equitable approach to the work that we do. So I'll stop there because I know we'll jump into questions. But mahalo for letting us kind of speak. I haven't talked about origin stories in a while, so thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank you both again. It's like Lala said, I'm getting to know so much more about both of you just by hearing what you're sharing today. And also just want to point out what you said, Lala, about the binary. It's never sat well with you. And Mariana too. And I can see that through like how you're weaving your experiences together. It would be, how could you look at things as just one or the other when you've had so many experiences and you've seen so many things, and when there's just so many different factors in life. And thank you for sharing that. And you know, I feel like this question has already come up through the telling of your origin stories, but just want to highlight this question again. How do we see feminism and queerness in relationship to land stewardship?
You take that? Me and Mariana are like, you go, you go, you go, you go. Okay, you went first this last time, so I'll go. It's balanced. Yeah, going back to this idea of systems approaches, right? Like, I think the idea of a mechanized, industrialized, linear, categorized, man-made, built, structural, technological, intellectual reality is showing itself, and it's crumbling. And it's no longer, if it ever was, appropriate for the needs of our time. It's not, it goes exactly the opposite of what natural law asks of us. And I think that's where indigeneity and these ideas of feminine or queer theory, when it comes to understanding issues and then cultivating solutions or the alternatives to that, are really critical. We can't continue doing that, right? And so that relationship between, say, the oppression of queer and Wahine peoples in relationship to the extractive, toxic, violent relationship that the industrial era, especially over the past, you could say 500 years, but it's really accelerated in the past 150, has caused, right? That there's this dominion over something. And through economy, through religion, that's really rooted in capitalism and patriarchy. It looks at certain things, specifically land and natural resources, women's bodies, and queer bodies, as something less than, and that can be taken from and extracted for power and profit. And that's kind of the realities. We can go back 2,000 years, and Matt Lynch does a great job in sharing this on one of his podcasts around the history of like colonization and going back to Europe 2,000 years ago, and how even then land, women, queers were considered sacred, right? There was this idea of sacredness, and that actually the natural world, or the feminine, Mother Earth, was at the center of it. So there was really distinct protocols around society that made sure that there was an equilibrium and balance for those elements to be part, understanding that they highly contributed to the health and well-being of the natural and social systems that we lived in. And that started shifting for many reasons, which you could talk about for an hour. But that's kind of where I kind of navigate from when talking about stewardship in relationship to land, and looking at those similar issues or the similar root causes to oppression in certain group types. And today, really looking at Wahine and Mahu.
Thank you, Lala. Yeah, I would agree specifically with the idea of like having power over. I would say that's like across queerness, across queer bodies, across how women are treated and land. And it's like we have the power over to extract, to do what we want. You also mentioned reproductive justice, and that's a huge thing. Like the poorest people in the world are women. There's also been studies done that show that when women have resources and money, their entire communities flourish, right? And so when we think about land stewardship, the opposite of that, right? Like air pollution, water pollution, soil leak, like oil leaks, all of these things that don't allow us to grow our own food, drink our own water, things like that, that is immediately turning into like, are you able to reproduce? Are you able to have family planning that directly affects specifically poor women, usually women of color? As far as, I mean, this is all, the thing is like intersectionality really is a perfect word because none of these things exist in a vacuum. All of these things affect each other. And then when you live in the middle of that, where like all of these things are affecting you, then you don't get to just pick one thing that you fight for. And the reality is, it's, I guess maybe it's like the human psyche. It's like we're all here to usually fight for our own self-interest. Maybe, I don't know if that's, we could argue nature versus nurture. I think like community building contradicts that. But innately we're going to fight for what we need. And so I think when you look at a woman of color, an indigenous woman, an indigenous queer person that's affected by land pollution, air pollution, water pollution, like we have no other alternative than to fight for all of those things because we need all of those things to survive. So in my perspective, that's how all of those things are related to land stewardship.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're also kind of talking about the way in which is the next question I had, and you kind of just explained that too, the way in which women and queer people have experienced the same forms of oppression as the land. So I'm wondering if you want to share anything more about that, either of you, like just kind of breaking it down, like, or I mean, you are breaking it down, but just kind of going over more just how these connections happen and what they look like in society.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll jump in there, Mariana, if that's okay. Just thinking about especially the past 2 years of doing deep dive analyses on equity and climate justice, right? And really starting to look at holistic information, right? Institutions love data, right? Which is important. That they're actually not very good at using holistic data. When someone's talking about water, again, going back to this linear approach of our current archaic system, right? Like we're talking about water, that's all we're going to look at is water, the distribution of it, where is it at, where is it going? No, generally speaking, no relationship to anything around that, right? How does that connect to food security and subsistence farming?
Can you hear her still?
No.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was just me. Maybe she's reconnecting.
Yeah, she might be reconnecting.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll maybe jump in. Oh, wait, is she back? Nope, just kidding. I think some of this, which she started to talk on, was specifically like food security, right? And tied to water, clean water, and all of those things. Like when we think about the people that are marginalized in our society, poor people, brown people, Black people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, queer people. I don't know if I already said that. Anyway, there's this American idea of like individualism, right? And that like if you fall into this category of being oppressed, it's something that you've done and something that you have to get yourself out of. And yet, if you look at how Native Americans were pushed into lands that were not livable, that like are very rarely areas that people can grow food on, that's also how land for Hawaiian homelands was those people were not given like the best land to grow food on or the cleanest water. That was given to like capitalist businesses for cash crops, right? So when you think about the people that are often told like, oh, you're in your circumstances because you're lazy, you're poor, you're all of these things, but they've been displaced from their own lands and given literally little to no resources to even try to like grow their own food or have clean water, then like none of those things are ever connected, right? And so Lala, you're back on. Yay. I was piggybacking on what you said, but please continue.
No, go ahead. If you got more to go, I'd love to hear.
I was mentioning food security and how, like you mentioned, that the ties to water, and then that ties to land, and how poor Indigenous people, queer people, everyone that lives in the margins, with that tied to the idea of individualism that's like idolized as a core American value. And so often we are blamed for our own circumstances, even though we're constantly like displaced and pushed to those edges.
Mahalo for that, Mariana. Yeah, I mean, going back to kind of my experience in government, when I look at who holds power, like who's in the room and who's making the decisions, 89% of them are males, right? And mostly a certain demographic of males, cisgender, white. Here in Hawaii, there's a uniqueness, I think, a little bit around more of a mixed ethnicity. But looking at the gender issue, where is our representation? If there's more females, larger population is females, why aren't they in those positions of power? And that's everywhere. You look in government, you look in the environmental justice movement, right? Women typically are leading and have higher representation within community-led, activist-driven, grassroots initiatives around that, versus in these power positions of power, right? In institutions, whether it's giving out money or making laws. I mean, just in the energy sector alone. So my work was like, we're looking at adaptation, we're looking at mitigation, we're looking at housing, we're looking at food, we're looking at water, we're looking at energy. Try and just look in the energy field and it's dominated by men, right? So who's really, we talk about equity, who's really in the room and who has the power and influence to make those decisions. So kind of taking that apart a little bit, and I'm talking about women, never mind LGBTQ community, right? Or queer folks, and representing that more intentionally in places of power. So that's kind of where I hold the space as far as understanding that dynamic, and how do we get our institutions and individuals to reflect that, and saying like, the story that Hawaii doesn't have, Hawaii is not racist, it's not prejudice, it's not like the quote unquote mainland, but we share the same root causes of colonization, right? As the continent does, comes from there. So I think there's too much evidence when we look at data now not to look at these things and still be able to deny them. It's like, what are we going to do about it now that we know? Yeah.
Thank you, Lala. You've actually just transitioned perfectly into my next question, which is, how does colonialism create and perpetuate oppression of the environment, women, and queerness? So oftentimes we talk about colonialism as something of the past, right? So I'm wondering what you have to say about that. Either of you, both of you.
Yeah, I can start with this one. So I want to bring up like a lot of the affluent white men historically, especially in the last 100 years, that are seen as like the fathers of environmentalism, like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, who like created 150 national parks. And these people are like, when people talk about environmentalism, like they're like, oh, these are great men. And there's like no acknowledgement whatsoever of like the people that had been taking care of those lands for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that were absolutely displaced by creating these places mainly for white people to use and enjoy. A lot of people that live in poverty live in like outdoor deserts, and by that I mean like they have no access to parks, right? So like then there's that the other shift of like all of this is taken for the enjoyment and entertainment and usage of a certain demographic, because right, like anyone can go to them, but there's you still have to pay to get in, you still have to have access, you have to have transportation to get there, you have to have a car, right? Like all of these things, you have to have a job that allows you to have time off. And all of those things again intersection into poor people of color, specifically women who a lot of times end up being single moms, don't have access to those things. So I want to point out that like a lot of the people that are held at very high esteem for being environmentalists are actually like, they were also extremely racist, not just displacing indigenous people of those lands, but like were actually like horribly racist, and you can read about that too. So I would just like want to point out how we really need to be careful about who we idolize, and even if something is the way it is right now, right, like there's a lot of the indigenous movement is land back, because there is no acknowledgement of what was before, because this is all a lot of people know now. So when we talk about the environment being oppressed, well, in ties to colonialism, like this, I mean, for a president or like an environmentalist to walk into a place and be like, move aside, indigenous people, like go somewhere else, which has been done over and over and over again, like that is not just oppressing people of color, but that's absolutely like taking people that have known how to take care of land and just pushing them aside. Like in California too, there's been the discussion of like constant fires every fall, every summer, right? And there's historical data and information that indigenous people knew how to burn land specifically so that this wouldn't happen. And so now there's some initiatives to consult indigenous people, but that has been, I actually wanted to kind of touch on that, piggyback of the last comment, that's the government and like all of these committees that we have are so tied to connecting who's an expert to like Western education. And like there's so much indigenous knowledge that has not been passed on or is not even invited into the table. And a lot of times, honestly though, like when there are like government hearings and public hearings and there are people that know and have been doing this work that show up and speak up, they're absolutely like just set aside and ignored. But there just seems to like only be a value connected to a piece of paper that we spent 6 figures paying for. And that is also a giant part of oppressing women and queer people, who again end up being like marginalized, poor, because of colonialism.
Hello for that, Mariana. You know, another thing I want to acknowledge real quick in this space is like, we all are in this soup of colonization in some way, shape, or form, right? Like those that are consciously acknowledging it and trying to figure out and sense make, what does that mean for me and my kuleana, my family, my place. We can at least start there, right? I think it's really important. And understanding that colonization when it comes to patriarchy plagues us today, even in the movements, even in Indigenous Aloha Aina movements, right? There is still this patriarchy and a healing that needs to take place in order for us to collectively really move past this. It's not talked about. The gender issue around economics is kind of there, right? And the women's suffrage has really pushed that. But what it's done in many ways is looked at equality versus equity, right? So, oh, women want to have the same rights as men? Okay, so you're going to still need to care for the home, have children, raise them, and then come and work and compete in the job market, right? So when we talk about contemporary issues in the United States, the healthcare issues, right? Universal healthcare, specific healthcare for trans and queer community members, right? You know, we're pretty much the only developed nation in the world that doesn't have universal health care and give women a year off to have a child and start raising them. So I think from the kind of capitalistic patriarchal framework that's still in existence and holding on for dear life to stay in existence, we come down to this component of health. And I think we really need to consider from a gender perspective, health of the land, health of the body, health of the collective, right? And even looking at not just the laws of nature, but the rights of nature. I think that's something that's really interesting to play with as we talk about these queer feminine spaces of liberation and healing. What would that look like if queer and feminine spaces were able to have those powers of positionality and power, in looking at how our environment should be considered as a relation or as kin? Should water have its own rights, right? You can see places like Aotearoa that are pushing towards that in many ways, in other countries, I think in South America, if I'm not mistaken. But I think there's so much opportunity that's relevant to the needs of our time, and it's really just continually leaning into that in all our little spaces. It's going to take generations, but it's happening. So that's kind of what keeps me going in the decline of our current system and what's coming next, because it's already being embodied and it's already happening here, right here at home and around the world.
And I just wanted to add to that, the split within our own movements between men and women and queer people, and the silence that it perpetuates when it comes to domestic violence. And this is also something that, for example, Black women had to exist within the civil rights movement of having to choose between the Black community's rights and women's rights. And so, like, again, this is where intersectionality ties back in, because whether you choose one or the other, like, the other side's gonna just rake you over the coals for it, right? And so there's a constant choosing of, I always like to say, we're never, communities that are oppressed are never fighting to get to the top. We're always fighting to not be at the bottom, because that is like, you know what that feels like a lot of the times, right? So like a lot of times we're just like, oh, like maybe if I see these people that have more privilege, that is also me, then I'm going to benefit from that. And like, can you blame someone for like their own survival and for their own attempt at thriving? Yes or no? I don't know. Depends on what, like, you know, how I'm feeling. I might answer that differently. But domestic violence in particular is a huge problem. And I also want to add, like, I think a lot of people think of domestic violence in heterosexual relationships as the norm. And there's also a huge problem with that. And the problem is we are scared to speak up a lot of the times because we don't want to disenfranchise our own people. We don't want to make queer people look bad. We don't want to make Indigenous people look bad. And so women of color, queer, trans people, queer women, like, suffer in silence a lot of times. And there's very little resources for them to actually get help. So that's another way that this is all tied together.
Definitely. And there's just so much to talk about, and especially with intersectionality, there's so much that is tying together right now. And while I want to honor the time and open it up for Q&A, I'm also going to ask the last two questions. I'm going to try to just ask the last two, and then we can kind of open up a dialogue based on that, because I think they're important questions, but I also think there's going to be some questions for you from our audience today. So bringing this back to community here in Hawaii, what are some of the biggest obstacles that impede us as communities here in Hawaii in terms of intersectional environmental justice? And then the last question is, how do you see a decolonized future that is inclusive of and equitable towards women, queerness, and land protection?
Those are just like two kind of nonchalant questions, right? Those are big, beautiful questions. The obstacles, maybe we can start there and then give way to the futures that are being birthed and emerging and embodied right now. At least maybe I'll go in that flow. I mean, the biggest obstacles is kind of what we talked about, like the system we're in, right? And I think specifically, at least in my experience in Hawaii, is the good old boys, the big five, the plantation, colonial economics, and there's a reason why they're called the good old boys. My mother, who worked for many years as a lobbyist and in government and with Senator Inouye, used to tell me stories on the inside, and she had to distance herself eventually because she was becoming too outspoken with that oligarchy, you could say, in a way. And there was nothing that was going to allow the good old boys to not proceed with their agendas. And I think there's, wherever we're at on this kunane board, you know, where this isn't checkers where everyone has to be doing the same thing, but we are in the same rhythm as far as some of the obstacles, right? And that's everything from going back to the root cause is, how do we talk about and start normalizing and then organizing around, more intentionally around Hawaii as an illegally occupied sovereign nation, right? I think starting from there, if we look at who is the last reigning monarch here, it was a wahine, right? And I think that's kind of like, okay, how do we start normalizing that? And I think in the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that has, with the Renaissance, slowly been seeped into. I think on the ground, start doing, you know, from an institutional standpoint, if we want to look at the institutions as having kind of not kind of, but dysfunctional entities to what equity should look like. How do we start looking and analyzing that and synthesizing information and data and voices to start better? You know, Mariana said she loves community organizing. I think we do it here. And I think we have a lot more opportunity to grow more intentionally in that way, to really organize ourselves on identifying what are those big obstacles, and then being able to look at resource sharing and opportunities to connect the dots and resources. I think this next generation is really coming up from behind with a fierceness that I'm excited about. And I think that's where, looking at, in all spaces, there's obstacles. And what I'm excited about is that the generations that are coming up, we're already seeing that. Within my lifetime, I've seen that shift. I've seen the embodiment now. You have women in power and positionality, and queer folk in power and positionality, whether it's in the institutions and university systems or executive directors for Aina-based organizations like Paipai Oheia, right? These are all wahine-led that are reestablishing their place in society in contemporary times. I think more of that can be nourished. And I work in the juxtapose of like really grassroots, and then pollinating into the philanthropic world, pollinating into the government space to look at these kind of legacy institutions and start incepting what can't be denied. Like, how do we ride this wave of this trend around equity, not to lessen the harm and trauma that is still occurring and being experienced with the current institution's decision-making processes, but really look at there is a larger movement taking place. I think that's not gonna, not that I think, I know is not gonna go away. So I think like, where can we find our spaces to connect in on that? I think is really important as far as what's next, because it's already here. Yeah.
Thank you, Lala. As far as what the biggest obstacles are in my perspective, I think, like we mentioned before, the fact that a lot of people are like refuse to acknowledge that there's racism in Hawaii is a gigantic problem. Because if people aren't willing to acknowledge something, like, you're never going to figure out how to fix it. And that is also tied into colorism, which is also a problem here. Asian settler colonialism. And I think there's the very distinct thing that people don't often tie together, and that's like Hawaiian culture and local culture, because local culture is largely set by affluent Japanese people, and that culture is often don't ruffle the feathers. And then there's a lot of Hawaiian people that are like, no, this is, you guys, this is an illegally stolen land. It is illegally occupied. We do not consent to any of these things. And we will never stop talking about this, because for all of the reasons that we know, right? So there's a lot of things that I believe don't even allow for a conversation that's like encompassing all of the community, because people are really comfortable with the privilege that they have, and acknowledging that they have privilege will often make you have to shift your behavior, right? So some of the things that I would piggyback on is like the resource funding, like you said, the philanthropy, the government is, let's fund and resource those like community building, root building, all of those things that often are led by women of color, Indigenous women, queer women. We are highly under-resourced. So places like Hawaii People's Fund that are like directly funding those projects and movements are hugely important. I would also say, I mean, this is something that I would like say I like live by, and it's like silence is always going to be complicit in oppression. So speak up when you say something and figure out where your privilege lies so that you can make a difference. Because it is really hard to constantly fight for your own humanity, to defend your own humanity. As like a queer Indigenous woman, I'm like, I'm exhausted all the time, because I'm like, do I ever get a break to just exist and like enjoy and live in joy? Because I'm constantly having to fight for just like defending my own existence. As an immigrant too, right? Like, it's like constant defensiveness, which is a horrible way to live. But in that sense, I see like I have an able body. I am cisgendered. So in those two ways, I can be a great ally and accomplice to people that don't align with that, right? So if I'm in a workplace and like, okay, do all of our policies, is that gender inclusive? How are we in like bathrooms? Like, are people able to access these things? So those are ways that even if you are in a marginalized group, whether or not you are, right? Like, better for you if you're not, help all of us. But those are ways that you can just like do little things, and that is like just people power. And the more that we are able to acknowledge and act on our own privileges, the better all of us are going to be.
I love that, Mariana. I love that because we all have some form of agency for the most part, right? And I know we want to open it up to questions, but I do want to like one more thing to maybe to lean in on and kind of continually unpacking these binary terms, right? Like even indigeneity. And this is something that I think is really important. You know, today we identify those that are indigenous as people that have been on their ancestral land, right? But if we take it to a broader approach, and Auntie Manu Meyer, Dr. Manulani Meyer is beautifully through her holographic epistemology, AKA indigenous common sense. Really, she's like, you know, all indigenous means is continuity. And those that we're identifying as indigenous today have never broken their connection to their ancestral land and that knowledge base, right? So open that up, because if that's the case, at some point in time, we're all indigenous to someplace on this earth, right? So even taking those words of like what we're using now to help us as tools to be distinct and explicit on who we need to prioritize, who has solutions. I also like even move beyond that, right? Like how can we all start being indigenous to our place that we're in? If we can't go back to that place, what did our ancestors do in their indigenous places to care for that? I guarantee you it looked a lot like the Native Hawaiians. It looked like a lot of the Native American tribes at one point, right? So just even unpacking that and moving beyond, like, instead of decolonizing, what if we're gonna indigenize, right? Instead of continually fighting back and reacting, I'm not saying that's not important, it's all needed. And also, so again, break through those binaries. This thing is breaking down. How do we decolonize it? And what's being built? What does that indigenous future look like? And how can we, no matter where we come from, relate to that in our own space and time? So yeah, I'll stop there. Mahalo. This is such juicy conversation.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to just not keep talking. And you know, that's another reason why we put together a list of resources, and there are so many more, but we've put together some of those. So as we transition and hand it over to Laurel to read the questions, we're also going to share the resources that we've compiled, so you can take them down, look at them on your own time. And yeah, I would love to keep talking to both of you. I think it's time we listen to those questions though. So Laurel, whenever you're ready. Bye.
Great, thank you. The first question that came in was from Stacy, who asked, are there any authors, artists, and or groups you're paying attention to that are particularly helpful in helping us queer folk develop our sense of queerness in order to make the connection to environmental issues, and vice versa, developing our sense of environmental issues that could help us connect to queerness?
I think of Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategies, Pleasure Activism. That's one that I follow. Queerness as well as feminism. Yeah, Adrienne Mariana wrote that down too. That's definitely one of them. Octavia Butler is another one with Afrofutures. Yeah, Mariana, I don't know if you wanted to speak on that list.
I'm just typing it in because I always like to like go back and look at that. But yes, the author of The Body's Not an Apology, and I'm so sorry I don't remember her name. Hold on. Sonia Renee Taylor. Are the book that you're reading right now, Lala, is there one main author?
Oh, Lala, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So this just came out. I highly recommend. It's called Required Reading: Climate Justice, Adaptation, and Investing in Indigenous Power. And actually, Kaniala Ing wrote the introduction, and there's brilliant Indigenous voices from Aotearoa to Canada that are bringing in their voices and their ike into this space, their brilliance into this space. So I just got it. I started reading it last night. That's definitely another one. And on that resource slide is another one that I want to lift up that is kind of from a local context. I mentioned Jamaica Osorio earlier, the book that they just came out with. And it's called Remembering Upena of Intimacies, Kanaka Maoli Mo'olelo Beyond Queer Theory. That's definitely a good one that I haven't read yet, but I've been watching their book launches and I'm really excited to dive into that. And I'm a podcaster listener, so there's like a million podcasts we can share, and there's a few on the resource link as well.
Let's see. Next question was from Wendy, who asked, if the US empire collapses due to the environmental and economic issues we face, what do you think will happen to Hawaii, and how should we prepare for this potentiality?
That's a great question.
I feel like it's already collapsing. Like, let's get real with that. It's already collapsing. So, you know, I would love to, at least from my perspective, like it's in decline. It's following the pattern of every empire, almost to the T. So
right, and right. There's this sense of like never-ending power because of the military-industrial complex, specifically here in the middle of the Pacific, and also like there's like this giant ignorance of most Americans that like refuse to acknowledge that the U.S. is in so much debt. Like there's this thing that people just refuse to acknowledge. You're like, I don't know, but we have all the guns, we have all the planes, we have all the military things. And it's like, we got no money. And that will affect. So yeah, like Lala said, it is happening. And most Americans, because of American values, refuse to acknowledge that. What will happen to Hawaii? I don't know. I think the vast military presence here, what will happen with that? But I hope that there is, with the resurgence of all of this power to the people movement, that I hope that we're kind of setting ourselves up to take care of each other. Because at the end of the day, queer, poor, Indigenous people, queer women, all of these people, we've had to learn to have to take care of each other. We've had to create our own communities to survive. And so we are able to create what a future might look like, because we've had to learn out of just a need to survive.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think I dance in between understanding how Hawaii's positionality within US global neopolitical imperialism and their agenda. That's a little scary. And I'm also really inspired by all the work that's been done, especially in the past 40 years with the Lo'āina movement here. I think outside of figuring out that military thing, we are positioned, I think, really in a good place geographically to be able to sustain ourselves for the long term. And I'm not talking about just Oahu-centric, big city, kaka'ako. I'm not too confident about those communities necessarily as far as climate resiliency. But those that know where their waters are, know how to build, know how to grow food, those that are closest to Aina, I think will have the highest likelihood and chance of survival and building back. And really looking at that last resource in the guide, thank you, Anya, for dropping them all in the chat. But that Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs, a feminist economic recovery plan for COVID-19, the brilliance that that was written in, to me, can be used not just for the COVID-19 epidemic, but in general. What should our economy really look like, right? And so what does an Indigenous sovereign nation of Hawaii look like? How does that matriarchal, how do we, instead of repatriation, how do we look at rematriation, which is another movement that's happening right now with a lot of the land back. So really continually centering these quote unquote feminist and queer worldviews into shifting out of extractive industrial violent era into one that is going towards healing and regeneration.
Great. Next question, Stacy asks, how can we ensure deeply connecting the future generations of intersectional youth, being aware of passing on historical, cultural, generational trauma in a deep way that builds systemic structures that dismantle environmental oppression? In your experience, what are the first few steps to that?
Healing ourselves. Healing ourselves so we don't keep passing it on. And it's hard work. It's exhausting. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we are not at fault for our trauma, but we are responsible for healing. And that sucks, but it's also empowering, right? It's, again, I think it's like we have to resource communities that need social workers. We need them in schools, we need psychologists, we need and like people of color that are doing this, not white people that are like telling you why it might be your fault. It's like people that are aware of the trauma and are going to validate it so that we can heal from it. And that's also, I guess, like another tie into the problem with idolizing Western education, right? I think there is also a space for like building community around that and just like sharing. I think there's still a lot of stigma around like sharing trauma, even though we've all experienced it. And when we lack the resources to heal, and we feel shame to talk about those things, that's like really setting us up in a bad place. So creating more spaces to be really open and create community around that to heal.
You hit it. I think that to me, Mariana, is the healing aspect. I think like the second half of my life, if I, God willing, I just want to move in that space of regeneration and healing and like acknowledgement. I don't necessarily want to, at least my place now is not necessarily fighting back or fighting against kind of that resistance, but like there's going to be more challenges ahead, right? We're talking about generations of undoing. So sinking into that reality, and also the reality that we are part of generations to come, and that we have that agency and ability to start shifting, right? Like we can, maybe we can't control everything out there, but to Mariana's point, one thing that we do have power over is ourselves. And if we can begin with that little set of really intimate understanding, and being able to heal and move through the acknowledgements of the trauma that we've experienced. And even if you don't know what that is necessarily, there are ways in order for you to just start acknowledging how can I move through this space in a different way? And I think for the youth, looking at the next generations, right? Like stop the cycle. Go and give to Hawaii People's Fund. Go and start looking for places of opportunity to learn more about, or volunteer at, or give $5 donation, to organizations within your area that are supporting, and that's in the resource guide as well, whether it's the human trafficking issues, sex trafficking issues here in Hawaii, or it's Aina-based education initiatives, or women's health. That's another big one, We're seeing a lot more grassroots organizations popping up around, you know, body sovereignty, women's health, taking back our birthing rights. And the queerness aspect of that, I think I'm seeing more, I am seeing more intention around providing kokua understanding and healing in that space. And those are really in Aina-based and arts-based places that I've noticed, as far as like, what are the resources available to us locally, or even, you know, the digital world is a whole nother level, but I just keep thinking local. I really look at Aina and arts initiatives as places where there is a safe place in general. And when I talk about Aina arts places, I am talking about locally, you know, rooted, Native Hawaiian rooted, that are providing safe space for expression for youth at young ages through the arts, safe place to unpack trauma in the Aina. There's a lot of young youth groups, especially around young boys, that have, you know, are coming out of the foster care system or houselessness issues. So the ways that we want to learn and give and interact, like let's dial in, because they're here. They may not be as easily able to find, but White People's Fund, I think, is a great start. And doing a little bit of research on your own will help kind of dial that in. But yeah, Aina Arts, to me, that's the holistic approach to how we're going to get through this moving forward.
I think some of, like, just piggybacking off that, some like first few steps is like get to know your neighbors, like build community in where you are, because those little things that we do that build community, that is like, okay, like I have avocados like here, like, and you're creating that connection with land and with the people around you, and like that will have, it might be a small effect at first, but that is going to have a much larger effect later on. And then that is like also dismantling systemic structures that are, especially like with American idealisms of like individuality, because we are building community around us and with land.
Great. There's a lot of great resources that have been shared in the chat. I'm not seeing any other questions come through, and I know we're nearing the end of our time together today. So Anya, I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing thoughts. And yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't mean to call you out, Mariana, but you have a beautiful poem that, you know, we're going to share if there's time. And I just want to open up the space for that if you'd still like to share it.
All right. Let me pull it up. I always get nervous when I read my poems. All right, this is called My Tongue. My tongue learned a second language at 5 and a third at 8, expanding my ability to communicate and relate to others' humanity. Yet you make fun of anything that doesn't sound exactly like your version of what perfect English should sound like, forgetting your British roots and that it was you who bastardized the language you so critically judge others by. Because my body and my tongue know that there is so much more than what you can describe in English. The language we use is derived from our surroundings, from our observations, from disconnecting from our devices and immersing into our connection to the elements. My tongue can identify and expel words that your narrow vision can't fathom. How many times have I asked, is there a word for this or that? How many words do you have for rain or clouds or winds? How many words do you have for love? For how you love, for who you love, for how deeply you love. My tongue now knows its worth, healing after internalized embarrassment imposed onto it for not pronouncing words to your liking. My tongue knows some words will always be a little twisted as they make their way out, and it no longer gives a fuck. My tongue has felt the burn as it has spit flames like a raging dragon to defend myself from pointed arrows. It has learned to cool off by chugging milk when your mouth is on fire, because it knows the world doesn't need more rage. It now expels kindness, love, and acceptance, but it will still hold a shield when it's appropriate. My tongue knows the flavors of food, ingredients derived from the depths of the ocean and the peaks of mountainous forests. You think they're gross because they're not grown in acres of arid land in the middle of the Bible Belt, but the flavors that have graced my tongue are intricately delicious and unique, and one of a kind when combined, just like me in my intersectionality. My tongue loves the beauty of the unknown, and it appreciates the exhilaration of the new. My tongue knows respect of attempting and learning, even if stumbling through the language of the place it is a settler on. My tongue knows love for Aina, Kai, Ala Eli, and Kahau Puna. My tongue tastes the rainbow, every color and flavor without discrimination, and it recognizes the treat that is the sweetness of her sea. My tongue tastes and tries without judgment because it has felt it, and it will not perpetuate hate, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, or ignorance. I hope you're willing to check your taste buds because bland isn't cute. Thank you.
Mahalo. I love that. Mahalo, T.
Mahalo. I think that's a beautiful place to conclude this session. I just want to thank you again so much and thank everyone for coming to this discussion. I know it's a heavy one, but it's an important one. And I'm also so happy that we got to talk about ways of healing, ways of building community. And, you know, I know that we're carrying that like after this session, but it's so important to have these discussions. So thank you for giving your energy, your space, and your time and being here today. And with that, I hope you all have a beautiful Friday.